friends. Thanks for spending your Friday with us, or whatever day it is that you're listening. There's nothing better than finding a way to connect with fellow true crime-loving weirdos, and that's precisely why we created our own true crime cults.
But not to worry, you've landed in the cult with all of the baby goats and none of the brainwashing. Grab a flower crown, find a seat around the campfire, and settle in for another story on the subject that brought us all together, murder.
In case you're just finding us for the first time today, allow us to introduce ourselves. I'm Angelina, and I'm here with my peculiar pal, Aurora. How's your week going?
It's going great. I had a fun little boating adventure over the weekend. It was so nice. This is like the reason why people live in Vancouver must be because of the fall, because like it is so like it's pleasant. It's like perfect, like around 72 to 75 for Americans and closer to like low 20s for everyone else. And it's just like, it's magical. Like it's sunny every day. And it was like the perfect day to go out on a boat. Wow. And we brought Sebastian the Pomeranian that I wasn't sure how he would react, but he's got his sea legs.
Oh, yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, he loves a boat. Who knew?
Igor got her sea legs too, but it wasn't easy. Like in the first moment that I took Igor on a boat, it was so funny, but it was a ferry and I snuck her into my cabin on the ferry. And so I let her out of the bag and she comes running out. And then she looked like a cat from like a cat litter commercial or something. Like she like grabbed onto the ground and then she was like, and just like she was going to puke and was like moving around. And I was like, whoa. And then like a minute later, she was like, just kind of like, all right, got it. And then just like,
my God,
after that, sat in the porthole, got some cute pics. It was a nice adventure. You're not supposed to bring cats in your cabin, but
I'll bet.
But I did anyway.
She's a pirate cat.
Yeah, that's it. Dolly has not tried it yet.
Next time.
Yeah.
Well, just because you tune into our show every week, we like to think of you as honorary monsters. But if you want to make it official, you can join the MMN commune on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/MurderMurder.news to sign up. And in return, we'll give you a shout out on the show, name one of our baby goats in your honor. And of course, you'll have exclusive access to our regular patron-only content.
We want to remind you that we'll be at the Pacific Northwest True Crime Fest October 8th and 9th. Join us on Sunday for a special live in-person episode and find us at our booth all weekend long to meet your favorite podcast hosts. Grab yourself some new murder merch. You can find the link for where to buy your tickets in today's episode description or on our social media, and use code MM15 to get 15% off a single day or weekend ticket.
And just in case there's some small chance we're not your favorite podcast host,
then you can talk to us too.
Yeah, we'll still be there for you. And also CJ from Beyond the Rainbow will be there.
Oh. And yeah, she might be your favorite for sure.
Yes. And also the amazing doctors from LA Not So Confidential, which I'm very excited to meet in person. We've only met virtually before, but that podcast is just spectacular.
Yeah, totally. Excited to meet them all in person finally too.
Yes. Let's kick things off with a look at some of the true crime stories making headlines this week.
A woman is being held on charges of attempted murder and aggravated battery after her 3-year-old nephew was left in critical condition. Surveillance footage of a Navy pier on Lake Michigan from Monday morning appears to show a woman throwing a child into the lake and then doing nothing to help him. 34-year-old Victoria Moreno, who initially claimed to be a witness to the incident, eventually confirmed to police that she's the boy's aunt. She explained that she wanted to take her nephew Josiah on the rides, but he was acting up, so she held him off the pier by his shirt and let him go. Reports say that Josiah was in the water for 30 minutes before he was found by divers under cardiac arrest. New charges may follow an investigation by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office.
Wow, that is so terrible. And that reminds me of the headline we covered, months ago about the grandma who punished her grandchild by making her drink a bottle of, I think, like Jack Daniels or something, because she had, like, as a kid, she's like, what's this? And like picked up the bottle and she's like, oh, you want to find out? And she died. Like it's just so sad. Like, please don't do these wild things to children. Like, what in the world?
Yeah. Kids don't need punishment like that. And this is why you don't explore those things. It's they're, small creatures.
Terrible. Authorities say two 12-year-old girls from Parker County, Texas, plotted to each murder their fathers and then run away to Georgia together. But when authorities were called to the scene of a shooting at a Weatherford home last Tuesday, it was clear things hadn't gone according to plan. A 12-year-old girl was found lying in the street with a gunshot wound to the head, which investigators believe she inflicted upon herself after shooting her father in the abdomen and fleeing the scene. Police allege the girl had been planning for weeks to murder her whole family, including the pets. It's not clear what charges the Weatherford girl may face, but her friend has been charged with criminal conspiracy. The case is in its early stages of active investigation, and due to the ages of the suspects, information is limited. We'll be right back after a quick commercial break from one of our fellow Darkcast podcasts.
I'm Edward October, and I'm here at the October Pod Ranch in the Great Smoky Mountains. Almost every night here, there's a ghost story party around the campfire. In my family, we believe that scary stories are best told around a roaring fire with a bottle of wine. That's why bold individualists everywhere choose October Pod for their retro horror thrills. Our stories are so good because they're told with such care, understated, moody, and above all, chilling. Why don't you join us for retro horror of impeccable taste? Choose Octoberpod. Find us on YouTube or at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod. Retro horror for bold individualists.
And we're back.
Before we dig in, we want to offer a quick disclaimer. Though we joke about forming a true crime cult, that is not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, and we want you to know that we take the cases we're discussing very seriously.
We want to deliver each story with the utmost respect to victims and anyone involved. If you feel we've missed the mark, you don't like our tone, or if you notice we've gotten any details wrong, let us know with a quick email to MurderMurder.news@gmail.com and we'll make it right. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include poisoning and child murder. If any of those subjects are particularly sensitive for you, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
40 years ago this week, the Chicagoland area was rocked by an event that many point to as America's first instance of domestic terrorism. News of the attack and resulting investigation made waves around the world as we began to rethink our approach to food and drug safety and our trust in the fellow humans around us. The case brought about a lot of changes, but has plagued investigators for decades as a persistent cold case. This anniversary has reignited interest in the case, spawning a long-form podcast and an upcoming documentary television series. The pressure is back on for the department handling the case, and investigators are as determined as ever to bring about a resolution in the form of long-awaited charges in the murders of 7 people. But critics are concerned that tunnel vision might inhibit the investigation and lead the public into following a false narrative. Our sources for today's episode include articles in the Chicago Tribune, CBS News, and PBS, as well as a 2-part episode of the podcast Stuff You Should Know. As usual, you'll find a full list of sources in the episode description. I set my sights on this subject a while back and was surprised to find that on the very same day that I began my research for this episode, a brand new podcast series centered on the case came out. I can only point to the first 2 episodes of the podcast as reference material for my story, as that's all that's been released so far. New episodes will be released each week of October, and if you want to hear more about this case, I highly suggest that you check them out. I know I'll be listening. I'm hooked now. The television docuseries comes out on CBS 2 later this fall, so keep your eyes peeled for that one as well.
On their own, none of the deaths occurring on September 29, 1982 raise any suspicion of foul play, but that's not to say they weren't unusual. Sometimes strange things happen, but still can't be chalked up to murder. Those with curious minds can take a gander at the Wikipedia page titled List of Unusual Deaths for some prime examples. On May 1st, 1904, 19-year-old John Mortensen drowned in 6 inches of water as he fell during a seizure while duck hunting in New Zealand. On April 5th, 1923, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, George Herbert, died after he sliced the top of a mosquito bite while shaving, and it became infected. Some attributed his curious death to a curse of the pharaohs. On November 30th, 1958, British actor Gareth Jones died of a heart attack on the set of a live television play. Coincidentally, he was actually scripted to suffer a heart attack in a later act of the play. 47-year-old health food activist Basil Brown died of an overdose of carrot juice in 1974. In 1975, Alex Mitchell died of laughter, or rather of a laughter-induced heart attack while at home watching Kung Fu Capers. In short, shit happens, I guess. So in the event of a one-off unusual death of an otherwise healthy person, authorities aren't necessarily called in to investigate.
12-year-old Mary Kellerman awoke around 6 a.m. on Wednesday, September 29th in her family home in Schaumburg, a sleepy suburb northwest of Chicago. Mary had stayed home from school the previous day with a cold and had some lingering symptoms like a runny nose and a sore throat. She let her parents know that she still wasn't feeling so hot this morning and would need to stay home in bed for another day. Her mom, Gina, and her dad, Dennis, figured their daughter's illness was no big deal. Another day of bed rest should have her back on her feet by Thursday. Dennis told Mary to take some Tylenol from the medicine cabinet and go back to bed. Gina Kellerman had purchased a bottle of 50 capsules the previous evening at a jewel store in Elk Grove Village. Dennis Kellerman told the Chicago Tribune, quote, "I heard her go into the bathroom. I heard the door close. Then I heard something drop. I went to the bathroom door. I called, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was no answer. I called again, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was still no answer. So I opened the bathroom door and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas," end quote. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Elk Grove firefighter Richard Keyworth described Dave Spung as one of the best paramedics he had ever met. Quote, "He threw everything in that drug box at this young lady and nothing made a difference."
Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead on arrival at the Alexian Brothers Medical Center in Elk Grove Village at 9:56 a.m. Because of Mary's sudden death at just 12 years of age, Mary's family was questioned and her body was sent to the Cook County Medical Examiner for an autopsy. According to Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Edmund Donahue, there was nothing suspicious about Mary's death. Firefighter Richard Keyworth noted that Tylenol was listed in the ambulance report because part of the job of a first responder is to fill a report of every drug the patient has taken, everything they could have recently consumed, so that the record would show anything out of the ordinary if there should be any ensuing investigation. "Everybody in the world took Tylenol," said Keyworth. "That didn't seem out of order." Mary Kellerman was initially assumed to have suffered a stroke, which resulted in her death. Mary had been an only child. She had a close relationship with her parents and many good friends at school, where she was in 7th grade. She cared for the family pets, 3 dogs, and a goldfish. She had her own pony, who she loved to ride and spend time with. She was taking guitar lessons and enjoyed making pottery, once gifting her school teacher a handmade vase, which she kept for decades afterwards. Mary did gymnastics, she enjoyed cooking with her mom, and in the last year of her life, she had taken up babysitting.
The same morning that Mary collapsed, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janis called in sick to work, complaining of cold symptoms. He didn't have the sore throat or runny nose that Mary Kellerman had suffered. He just felt generally unwell. By late morning, he was experiencing some mild chest pains. He went to pick up his 2 young children, Kathy and Thomas, from preschool and decided to stop at a Jewel grocery store on the way home. It was actually his wedding anniversary, and thinking of having a romantic night in with his wife, Teresa, Adam bought a couple of steaks, a bouquet of flowers, and some Tylenol, which would help him get back in shape after feeling kind of off all morning. He pulled into the driveway of the family's bungalow in Arlington Heights and put away the groceries. Adam prepared a lunch for himself and the kids, and after clearing the table around noon, he announced that he was going to take a couple of Tylenol and lay down for a while. According to Helen Jensen, a public health nurse for Arlington Heights, quote, "A couple of minutes later, he came staggering into the kitchen and collapsed. Medical director of Northwest Community Hospital's intensive care unit, Thomas Kim, has stated, "Our first job is to resuscitate, and we couldn't even do that. His heart just would not resuscitate. I signed Janice out as probably cardiac death." Adam's wife, Teresa, his mother, Aloja, and father, Ted Janice, his brothers, Stanley and Joseph, and several other friends and family members were all in the hospital waiting room to receive the news of Adam's death, resulting from a presumed heart attack. Around 3:30 p.m., the whole gang left the hospital and went back to Adam and Teresa's house to discuss plans for his funeral.
Adam's younger brother, Stanley Janice, suffered from chronic back pain, and with the stress of all that was going on, he had a pain flare and asked his wife to grab some Tylenol from Adam's cupboard. Stanley's wife, who was also named Teresa but went by Terry, decided she had a bit of headache and took 4 capsules from the bottle, 2 for her husband and 2 for herself. Within minutes, both Stanley and Terry had collapsed. When Dr. Kim heard that some members of the Janice family were on their way back to the hospital, he expected to see Adam's parents, who were old and frail and didn't take the news of Adam's passing very well. The stress of that situation could easily induce a heart attack in an older individual. He was shocked to hear that it was actually Stanley and Terry who had fallen ill. He'd spoken to them both in the waiting room, and they both seemed strong and alert. Stanley was a solid 6-foot-tall young man. He had just recently married Terry, who was only 19 years old, and the couple had honeymooned in Hawaii in the spring of that year.
Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Edmund Donahue initially suspected carbon monoxide poisoning, but the gas company found no traces of carbon monoxide in the Janice home. The next thought was that there must have been a virus outbreak, and the hospital asked the rest of the family to quarantine while they worked to figure out what was really going on. Again, in isolation, none of the deaths that had occurred so far would have been cause for suspicion. The only reason medical professionals and emergency responders were at all concerned at this point is because there were 3 who had collapsed within the same family who had been spending time inside the same house.
Around 8 p.m., a team visited the Janice house in Arlington Heights, the team consisting of Nick Pichos, an investigator with the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, public health nurse Helen Jensen, and a few police officers. Nothing stuck out as a possible culprit, but Jensen recalls counting the Tylenol left in the bottle on the bathroom counter. There were 6 capsules missing and 3 people down. She said, "In my mind, it had to be something to do with the Tylenol." Most of our sources mentioned that nobody really took Helen Jensen very seriously at that point, though obviously she was a respectable authority, being a dedicated public health nurse in Arlington Heights. Looking back, many publications and personal accounts seem to be unsure of who could have been the first to point to the Tylenol, but Jensen asserts that she was insistent and had to push them to check the Tylenol because no one was listening to her. Quote, "I plopped the bottle down and said, 'This is the cause,'" Jensen told Chicago Mag. "And of course, nobody would believe me, and I stamped my feet. They said, 'Oh no, it couldn't be. It couldn't be.'" End quote. By 8:15 p.m., Stanley Janice was pronounced dead, leaving Terry Janice in critical condition and not expected to survive. Meanwhile, strange symptoms continued to plague seemingly random citizens of the greater Chicagoland area.
At 3:45 that afternoon, shortly after Adam Janice was declared deceased, 27-year-old Mary Lynn Reiner, who went by Lynn, collapsed in her home in Winfield. Lynn had a large family and a very active life. She played the drums. She loved softball and bowling. She loved to cook and was proud of her Irish heritage. Happily married to Edwin Reiner, the couple shared 4 children, the youngest of which was welcomed into the world just 7 days before Lynn's passing. Having recently given birth to a baby boy, Lynn dealt with some postpartum pain by taking a couple of Tylenol. She had bought the bottle at Frank's Finer Foods less than an hour prior. Mary Lynn Reiner slipped into a coma and was rushed to Central DuPage Hospital in Winfield. Around 6:30 p.m., 31-year-old Mary Sue McFarland told her coworkers that she had been working through a bad headache that was just getting worse. McFarland worked as a sales rep at a Bell store in the Yorktown Shopping Center in Lombard, and she lived in nearby Elmhurst. Though it was 1982, the Bell store functioned very similar to cell phone provider stores existing around the world today. This was something they got into a bit on the Stuff You Should Know podcast, and I thought it was pretty interesting because I wasn't really sure where all the phone contracts and high-priced devices that we rent to own actually began. Allegedly in 1982, you would go to the Bell store and rent a rotary phone from them and set up a contract for landline services in your home. Classic capitalism. Another installment in There Were No Good Old Days. Anyway, back to Mary McFarland. She stepped into the back room at work and took a couple of Tylenol. Within minutes, she was on the floor.
John Milner, commander of detectives at the Elmhurst Police Department, told Chicago Mag, quote, "I didn't know her, but I knew her dad. It was just so sad that he lost his daughter like that. Somehow it was suspected that she had ingested something bad, poison or something," end quote. Authorities were beginning to catch on that there was in fact something suspicious about these sudden deaths, and that they may all be connected. Mary McFarland was rushed to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Downers Grove. Remembered as Mary Sue or Mary Mac, she had strawberry blonde hair and freckles, was outgoing and wickedly funny. She was a divorced single mother of 2 young boys, Ryan and Bradley, 4 and 2 respectively, and her children meant the world to her. Mary McFarland was pronounced dead at 3:18 a.m. on Thursday, September 30th. Mary Lou Reiner was removed from life support and pronounced dead at 9:05 a.m. Terry Janice held on until 1:15 p.m. on Friday, October 1st, when she was pronounced dead.
There was actually a lawsuit between the Janices and the Tarasowicks, Terry's family. The story of this lawsuit still makes the rounds in law schools across the country. Stanley Janice's life insurance policy was such that if his wife survived him, the payout would go to Terry or her estate. If Terry passed away first, or if the two died simultaneously, the beneficiary would be Stanley's mother. Because Stanley was pronounced dead 2 days before his wife, the benefit was paid to Terry's estate, to her parents, the Tarasowicks. Aloysia Janice sued the life insurance company, claiming that although they were pronounced dead 2 days apart, both Stanley and Terry were delivered to the hospital in a brain-dead condition on September 29th. Mrs. Janice insisted that brain death was death for all intents and purposes. She said that just because Terry's body continued to function while hooked up to a respirator in the hospital, that did not mean she was alive. After a great debate with input from medical professionals concerning when exactly death occurs from a legal standpoint, the court ruled that Terry died after Stanley and the insurance payout belonged to the Tarasowicks.
At 5:40 in the evening on October 1st, a few short hours after the legal death of Terry Janice, the lifeless body of 35-year-old United Airlines flight attendant Paula Prince was discovered in her Old Town Chicago apartment, an open bottle of Tylenol on her bathroom counter. She had flown into O'Hare International Airport in Chicago from Las Vegas on the morning of Wednesday, September 29th. Security camera footage caught Paula purchasing a bottle of Tylenol from Walgreens on Well Street at 9:16 that evening. Investigators believe she took the pills around 9:30 p.m. and probably passed away shortly thereafter. Her body wasn't discovered until she failed to show up for work on October 1st. Paula had been a single, jet-setting, bombshell blonde with a love for travel and adventure. Always laughing and having fun, she'd recently started her own party planning business. By 11 p.m. on October 1st, Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne announced to the press that the body of Paula Prince had been found. In the same press conference, she announced that every bottle of Tylenol would be pulled from the shelves of stores across Chicago. In retrospect, it appears that investigators put it all together relatively quickly, but as fast as they acted, authorities feared for the worst. After Nurse Jensen identified Tylenol as a common thread in all 7 deaths, they still had to determine what had been done to the Tylenol and by whom. They had to warn the public to avoid taking Tylenol lest they have additional deaths on their hands. It wasn't immediately obvious at what point the Tylenol was tampered with or if there could be other compromised bottles laying in wait in medicine cabinets across Chicago. Or could this go beyond Chicago? Perhaps even beyond the border of the United States. While investigators worked diligently to crack the case, people around the world worked themselves into a panic.
Shortly after 10 p.m. on September 29th, when Stanley Janus had recently been pronounced dead and his wife Terry was still on life support, investigators rounded up the bottles of Tylenol that had belonged to the victims and emptied them of their contents. Investigator Nick Pichos was overwhelmed by the strong smell of almonds. As we mentioned in an earlier episode about so-called Angel of Death Donald Harvey, only around half the population are able to detect the presence of cyanide by smell. And thankfully, investigator Pichos had that ability. Unable to test for cyanide in the blood at Northwestern Hospital, Dr. Kim sent some samples off to be tested elsewhere. Around 1 a.m. on September 30th, the lab results came back, showing something like 100 or 1,000 times more cyanide than was necessary to kill a person. Later that morning, an attorney for Johnson & Johnson showed up to the office of the Cook County Medical Examiner. Johnson & Johnson was the parent company of McNeil, the manufacturers of Tylenol. CEO Roy Dames announced his intention to hold a press conference, warning citizens to avoid taking Tylenol. "Do you have to?" complained the attorney. Asked by Dames if he had a better idea, the attorney came up with nothing. By 3 p.m., Johnson & Johnson had announced a recall of all Tylenol products from lot MC2880. Dames fielded calls from concerned citizens for the remainder of the day. Quote, "If you took it and you're calling me, don't worry," he assured them. Cyanide acts fast, and victims have little, if any, time to respond when they begin to feel the effects.
Panic in Chicagoland and beyond snowballed, and by Tuesday, October 5th, Johnson & Johnson had recalled each and every Tylenol product on shelves nationwide. 31 million bottles valued over $100 million. Allegedly, all the Tylenol was rounded up and burned, which concerned some. Johnson & Johnson said they tested everything for the presence of cyanide, turning over any contaminated bottles to the investigation and only burning what remained. Critics were concerned that the company could be carrying out a cover-up. Investigators theorized that the capsules were compromised after they reached store shelves. A popular theory, referred to as the mad poisoner theory, is that the perpetrator either stole or purchased some Tylenol from each affected store, put cyanide inside the capsules, and then either returned the purchased bottles to the retailers or snuck the stolen bottles back onto the shelves. This can't be confirmed because of the early 80s approach to surveillance. We mentioned that Paula Prince was caught on camera purchasing a bottle of Tylenol from Walgreens. At that point in time, if a store did have surveillance, it was typically just one camera pointed at a cash register. It was widely believed at the time that criminals would only target a retail store to take cash from the register. Also, as the Stuff You Should Know podcast pointed out, stores were often more concerned with employees slacking off than criminals prowling the aisles, so cameras were more often put in place to monitor employees. Clearly, surveillance had to be stepped up after the Tylenol incidents, but even more urgently, companies like Johnson & Johnson had to make their packaging so that their products weren't so easy to tamper with.
Prior to 1982, literally every product was vulnerable, with virtually no tamper-resistant packaging in place. If you bought a bottle of Tylenol, all you had to do was pop open the lid to get at the pills. There was no child-proof cap, there was no shrink wrap, and no foil seal over the mouth of the bottle. But it wasn't just Tylenol, it was every product. The Stuff You Should Know podcast reminisced about a time when moms would open up milk bottles in grocery store aisles, give the contents a sniff, and put the bottle back if it wasn't to their liking. Considering just how exposed everything was, it's shocking that it took until 1982 for someone to exploit that. In addition, product tampering was not made a federal crime until after the Tylenol attacks. Johnson & Johnson announced that every new bottle of Tylenol to hit the shelves would have 3 levels of protection. That foil seal, the shrink wrap, and the outer box would also be glued shut. Critics pointed out that everyone knows how to use glue, and a hobby shop owner took to the local news to describe how easy it was to shrink wrap. Prior to 1982, there had been exactly 0 levels of protection, but after the Tylenol murders, folks wouldn't accept even the most booby-trapped of Tylenol packages. Johnson & Johnson had a PR scandal on their hands as consumers discovered they had other options. Tylenol was so widely popular that in the early 1980s, people took it for everything. Sore throat, Tylenol. Chest pains, Tylenol. Hence why so many victims in varying circumstances were exposed to cyanide. After the Tylenol murders, people turned to Bayer, Bufferin, Anacin, or Excedrin when feeling under the weather.
Johnson & Johnson's swift response to the poisoning is now considered the gold standard for how businesses should respond to a crisis. This case is still discussed in business schools around the world. Aside from working with the FDA to develop tamper-resistant packaging that would become the industry standard for all varieties of retail products, Johnson & Johnson also introduced the caplet at this time, a sealed gel cap that would be much more difficult to deliberately contaminate. Within a year, Tylenol returned to its previous rank of America's #1 pain reliever. That's so interesting. I was wondering what type form of pill this was and how it was tampered with. I was how much thought was put into this? Because now when I think of Tylenol, I think of a gel cap with Tylenol printed on it. And it's that would be so hard to mimic. You would have to really be invested.
Yeah, I think of that or the pressed powder pills that are now coated.
Yeah.
So obviously you can't get beyond that. But these ones were, it was the capsules were made of gelatin. And if you broke them open, it was just powder inside. So
more probably what supplements are, how they're sold today.
That. Yeah, for sure. The demand for tamper-resistant packaging on all sorts of products increased as hundreds of copycat attacks were carried out. In a seemingly unrelated attack, a woman from Yonkers, New York, died after taking 2 extra-strength Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide. In 1986, 3 more died after ingesting gelatin capsules that had been tampered with. Susan Snow and Bruce McNichol of Washington State died from cyanide poisoning after taking Excedrin capsules. Bruce's wife, Stella McNichol, was ultimately charged with those murders. Kenneth Ferries, a student at the University of Texas, died in 1986 after ingesting cyanide-laced Anacin. His death was ruled a suicide by the Travis County Medical Examiner. Also in 1986, a major recall of Procter & Gamble's Encaprin resulted from a hoax affecting the areas of Chicago and Detroit. Cyanide-tainted Sudafed resulted in the deaths of Kathleen Danaker and Stanley McWhirter in the Seattle area in 1991. Jennifer Melling suffered a coma in that same attack. Jennifer's husband, Joseph Melling, was charged and convicted in the Sudafed attacks.
A Tylenol task force was assembled, including 140 members of the FBI, state, and local police. The team chased down thousands of leads as calls and letters flooded in, fingering a variety of possible suspects. This part is reminiscent of The Monster of Florence, Italy's version of the Zodiac Killer, who we did an episode about in April of this year. Quote, "My father-in-law is pretty creepy. Maybe it was him. My ex-boyfriend works at Johnson & Johnson. They should look into him. My husband gave me Tylenol once and I vomited afterwards. Could he be the poisoner?" A profile of the so-called mad poisoner was developed, and investigators noted they were most likely looking for a Jekyll and Hyde type with a working knowledge of chemistry. Criminal analyst John Douglas with the FBI suggested that the perpetrator might visit the homes or grave sites of the victims if the information was made public. Funerals and burials were announced through various media outlets, and surveillance was put in place to see if any strangers showed up to more than one of the victims' funerals or if any suspicious characters were spotted lurking around. No leads came out of this operation.
The first suspect who was seriously considered was 49-year-old Roger Arnold. He was a DIY chemist who worked at a warehouse for jewel stores. As we mentioned, several of the contaminated bottles were purchased from jewel stores. A search of Arnold's home turned up a book on how to murder people, which included instructions for various methods of poisoning. Arnold also had 5 unregistered firearms. He admitted to previously possessing cyanide, but said that he got rid of it 6 months before the Tylenol murders. Ultimately, Roger Arnold was cleared as a suspect, but having come under suspicion did a number on his psyche. Arnold experienced a nervous breakdown, which led him down a dark path, and 6 months after being cleared in the Tylenol murders, he was charged with the murder of John Stanishaw. The unfortunate circumstances surrounding Stanishaw's murder involves a case of mistaken identity. Roger Arnold had grown paranoid and tried to imagine who might have pointed the cops in his direction. He set his sights on bar owner Marty Sinclair and wanted revenge. Outside Sinclair's bar, Arnold thought he spotted his target leaving the establishment, but it was really a lookalike, computer consultant and father of three, John Stanishaw, who Arnold then shot and killed. Convicted in 1984, Roger Arnold served 15 years of his 30-year sentence and then passed away in June of 2008, 9 years after his release from prison.
A new lead emerged when a letter turned up to the Johnson & Johnson offices reading, "Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the gelatin, it's easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account 8449597 at Continental Illinois Bank, Chicago, Illinois. Don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this letter. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do." The letter had a New York postmark, but the bank account number referenced in the letter belonged to a travel agency in Chicago, which had recently folded. Investigators approached the former owner of a defunct agency, told him he had nothing to do with the letter, but he knew exactly who wrote it. He remembered a particular creep called Robert Richardson, who had caused such a stink when the travel agency went under that he knew he hadn't heard the last of this dude. Robert Richardson was pissed off that his wife, Nancy, who had been employed at the travel agency, never received her last paycheck after being dismissed from her position.
A further look into Robert Richardson found that the name was an alias. The new suspect's real name was James Lewis, and his wife's real name was Leanne. James and Leanne had a checkered past, and both changed their names while embroiled in a case of credit card fraud. A further look into Lewis's past turned up a prior brush with murder as well. A few years back, James Lewis was charged in the murder of a former client. The dismembered remains of the client in question were discovered in the attic of the Lewis's home. However, the charges were dropped when investigators revealed that the remains had been discovered during an illegal search of the property, and no one had ever read James Lewis his Miranda rights. He couldn't be convicted, but most definitely did murder a man and dismember his body.
Lewis admitted to writing the letter, and when pressed by detectives, he even described to them how he would have put cyanides into the capsules if he had done it. He later dismissed the whole thing, saying, "That was just a speculative scenario. I could tell you how Julius Caesar died, but that doesn't mean I did it." Before investigators caught up with him, James Lewis relished the attention he was getting and continued to write letters to local news outlets and call into radio talk shows. Tracked down by a nationwide manhunt, James Lewis was arrested at a New York public library. James and Leanne Lewis had actually relocated to New York from Chicago shortly before the Tylenol murders took place. They tried, but investigators just couldn't place James in Chicago on September 29th. It's worth mentioning here that the contaminated capsules had a very short shelf life, and cyanide would have eaten through the gelatin and made a giant soggy mess inside the affected bottles of Tylenol within a few short days. Whoever tampered with the Tylenol would have to have been in Chicago on, or at the very least, shortly before September 29th. Lewis refused to provide a DNA sample that investigators could compare against traces of DNA left on the contaminated bottles. However, while on trial for extortion and credit card fraud, Lewis was forced to provide a sample. The fact there was no news of the results of the DNA comparison and the fact that investigators could not place James in Chicago at the time of the crime gave the impression that Lewis had been cleared of any involvement in the Tylenol murders. Lewis was adamant that he was not involved and explained that while he wrote the letter, extortion wasn't even his aim. He simply wanted to piss off his wife's ex-boss at the travel agency. James Lewis was sentenced to 10 years for extortion and another 10 years for credit card fraud. He served 13 years in prison and relocated to the Boston area upon his release.
Lori Dan came under suspicion in 1988 after she was found to have poisoned and shot a number of people in the area of Winnetka, Illinois, but no connection to the Tylenol murders was found. Strangely, the Unabomber was also questioned during the investigation into the Chicago Tylenol murders. Approached in 2011, Ted Kaczynski denied having any involvement, submitted to a DNA test, and was subsequently cleared as a suspect. Despite a sinking feeling just a month into the investigation that this case was too big to solve and that they may never uncover a valid suspect in the murders, the team persevered.
Meanwhile, Mary Reiner's daughter carried out her own investigation and has surmised that despite Johnson & Johnson's denial of such claims, the tampering must have occurred somewhere along the supply chain. A former Johnson & Johnson employee has also written a self-published book supporting that theory and rejecting the profile of the mad poisoner. In 2013, the FBI stepped down from leading the investigation into the Chicago Tylenol murders, and it was announced that local police would take it from there. At the moment, the Arlington Police Department leads the investigation and is working in conjunction with other local agencies in the surrounding area. Sergeant Rick Kappelman with the Arlington Heights PD notes that the investigation is very much open and active, and that even today, leads are actively being pursued. With the ongoing release of Unsealed, the investigative podcast series examining the case of the Tylenol murders, and the upcoming documentary television series Painkiller, the Chicago Tylenol murders are making headlines once again. Investigators have come back to review the circumstantial evidence collected over the course of the investigation. Media outlets call the case solvable, and authorities go one step further to declare the case chargeable.
Unsealed has revealed that despite a decade of silence on the matter, authorities are still actively pursuing James Lewis as their lead suspect. No charges have been laid at this time, and knowing that Lewis submitted to DNA testing decades ago and that investigators have been unable to place Lewis in Chicago at the time of the tampering, we're not sure how this will pan out. But we can say that the idea of closing a cold case 4 decades old, resolving the United States' first ever instance of domestic terrorism, is very exciting. Keep your ears and eyes out for further breaks in the case, and definitely check out the podcast and the TV series. We haven't heard the last of the Chicago Tylenol murders.
Really interesting.
It's just so weird how it, things pick back up again just at this very moment. I mean, it does mark an anniversary, but it's funny that the case that I chose was just coming right under the spotlight again.
Yeah. Interesting. And that is so spooky that supplements are still made in a way that could probably be not easily tampered with. They have foil seals and stuff, but it does
I think that's enough. I think it's the problem is you got to have at least one level of protection. Either it's the kind of capsule that can't be tampered with, or the bottle has some protections. I think we're fine with, as long as there's something protecting. They're not
but
just
also,
you can open them.
If the theory that the tampering came with at the supply chain level is true, then putting foil on it's not going to help.
Yeah, that's what's interesting to contemplate for sure. But I feel like that probably isn't what went down, but I find it's an interesting sort of conspiracy theory. I also don't think that James Lewis is their guy, but the way I see it is that, they're pissed that this guy should be in jail for a number of reasons. And it's obviously, since you could never get pegged for murder, they want to give some sort of sentence to him. Yeah, I mean, I guess at this point where it's 40 years in the past, even if they put the wrong guy away for it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the right guy is still out there.
So true.
So what are you watching this week?
I did watch a couple things. I watched Dahmer, or I did not finish Dahmer, but I watched part of Dahmer. It just upset me too much. I couldn't. And I finished there's a documentary about Lori Vallow on Netflix. It's Sins of the Mother or something.
Yeah. Is it good?
I thought it was really interesting because that case for me has been just so intangible. what is happening here? There's like talks of like zombies and like whatever. And like, I just couldn't piece it together because there's so many family members and like some of them are like the Valos, some of them are the Daybells, some of them are like her previous
a
name
blended
and
family.
marriage. And so like, I couldn't keep everybody apart. And this did a good job of kind of piecing together that family tree. And like, I had a lot of empathy in watching it for especially like her older, like adult son, who is married. And like initially police thought maybe he could have been involved, but he clearly was not. Like he, you know, just lost his like younger siblings and was just as upset as everybody else, like more upset, like as his siblings. But then I also just found out that somebody had posted in a Murderino group that he was recently just charged with sexual assault against his wife. And so it's like, well, dude, I don't like you anymore either. Like, so
yeah, that sucks. Damn.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. And I have like a much better idea of what the story actually is now. Like it was just sort of evasive to me. Like I could not wrap my brain around this entire thing, but now it all kind of makes sense. So I thought it was good.
That's cool. I definitely got the same vibe from the case where it was just like random factoids like floating around that were all like just one-upping each other with like how bizarre they were. So it was hard to keep track of. But I definitely am going to watch this one.
Check it out. It's interesting. How about you?
I watched the first episode of it's a 3-part series called The Real Bling Ring on Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that, you know, is fun. I saw the film, The Bling Ring, and I've read a bunch of things about this case before. So it's not necessarily new, but it's just like a new angle to look at it. So like in actually talking to like the ringleaders in this thing, you know? So
yeah, you know, I watched that too.
Oh, yeah, you did?
Yeah. And I guess I watched a lot of things this week for once. I have not finished it. I was watching it last night before bed. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting so far, but it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like I've been thinking so much about like the ethics of true crime, and it's kind of like a Dahmer thing. Like, why are we giving these people such a platform? Because the guy, Nick, seems to have no remorse, and it gets like worse and worse. And like, he's just like, well, they were like rich, who cares? And I really don't think he feels bad about it. But I thought that the show did an okay job, but they're not really interviewing any of the victims because I guess they're too famous, of pointing out that, you know, I'm all for like an eat the rich mentality and theory. Like, I don't believe in capitalism. Like, I don't really think it's great to accumulate so much wealth. Like, it's certainly not a gold mine. I don't like it. But and
it's hard to feel bad for someone that's just missing like one of their several $1 million items, you know?
Yeah, it's a little hard to feel bad about that. But then it is very easy to empathize with somebody feeling unsafe in their home.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
That's something
it's creepy having someone in your house, period. And that's icky.
And one of the actresses that I don't remember her name, and I don't know who she is, you know, like she was apparently quite famous around that era, like in the early 2000s, and she was on a TV show and maybe reality TV or something. Like she was saying she had gone to an Oscar party and was robbed while she was at the Oscar party by Rachel and Nick. And she came home and like knew that this suitcase she had that was like full of dresses and stuff she'd put it someplace and it was missing, and there were signs that somebody had broken in, and she can't go back into her house even 10 years later because that night she's like, somebody's in my house, somebody's in my house, somebody's in my house, and like she couldn't like get that thought out of her head. And like, I know as somebody that had somebody break into my apartment while I was there, and I caught him going through my purse, and like I chased him away, and thank goodness that was the end of it. But like, I did not feel safe in my apartment, even having nothing had happened. Just like the idea that somebody could walk in and invade my like place of solitude. Like, it was very hard for me to feel safe there again. Who are they
sharing that information with of how easy it is to get into your house? And like
once he knew, he did it once.
Yeah, and these people were breaking into the same people's house multiple times too. So like, I mean, the fact that you come in again and again is kind of creepy as well. So
it's very creepy, and just how
you would think they would have more remorse after all of this time, but
he seems to have none remorse.
Yeah.
And I have not gotten to the end, but like the way that he's kind of making jokes about it and whatever, it's like, it's just kind of gross to me. And it's like, is he getting paid for his participation in this film? I hope not.
But they did have, you know, they had all of these reality TV moments themselves and their own little bit of fame right after being charged with this as well.
For sure.
So that is pretty disturbing to see. It's just like a very 2000s crime for sure.
Well, one thing that brought me a little minuscule drop of joy, and I hope it does to those that were robbed as well, is that Sofia Coppola did make a movie about it. And I had seen that too when it came out years ago. They hated it. Like, they hated it for different reasons. Like, they made the girl that her mom is just like awful and vapid and like not there, and like basically trapping her 16-year-old daughter, whatever, like that girl. She claimed she was only involved in one robbery. I'm not quite sure if that was true or not. And that she was like barely involved. But in Sofia Coppola's movie, her character was played by Emma Watson.
Yeah.
And so she was like, they said she was the ringleader. Yeah. And Nick hates it because he's like, I was the ringleader. Why wasn't I top billed? Why did I get this? Like, why did she get Emma Watson and I got some like no-name actor? Like, I wanted a young Tom Cruise. And the girl that like got to like Emma Watson cast as her was like, I wasn't even a part of it. Like, she's like thinks it's making her look more guilty. So they hate that movie was made. And it's like,
it's a good movie. I liked it.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed it. And I really have always liked Sofia Coppola's films very much.
Yeah,
but
she's
now
great.
I'm just like, I don't know. I also there's so many things I don't like about this movie. Also, like when they're doing the like, how do you break into a celebrity home thing? And he like tells people how he was doing it. It's like, don't make it easier for people. Like, can we cut this?
Yeah, but I guess, I don't know, it's one of those things like the Tylenol that I think things have changed since this happened and people are more aware. They probably have super stepped up security in their homes, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that this is still happening from watching Real Housewives. Dorit Kemsley from Real Housewives of Beverly Hills had her house broken into while she was there and held at gunpoint this past year.
Oh my God.
So I don't think this is funny. I don't think it's in the past. And it's not like cute to be like, here's how you find security cameras on whatever. Like, no, it's not cute. And like, she's very traumatized. Like a lot of the current season they're airing right now of Beverly Hills is about her like being in therapy and like trying to like process thinking her kids were going to die and she was going to die by this person trying to steal her purses.
Yeah, it's not cool. It's we're all, you know, no matter how rich people are, like it's still, we're all human beings and we still should be respected as such, at least. Like, you don't want to scare the shit out of someone and give them PTSD no matter who they are. It's
it's not good. It's not cute. It's not funny. Like, I get it. I'm always like, you know, eat the rich, but like, I mean, like, let's restructure our tax system. Like, let's think if the way that we pay employees is like something like, if this is the way to do it. Like, I think there's ways to break down like accumulation of wealth that are not going into their homes and like scaring them at gunpoint.
Also, you don't need to target individuals. Like the problem with the disparity between the classes is that you know, there's a whole mass of people that are the rich people, and some of them are corporations as well, and some of them are groups of people. And it's like, you need to look at things at that level if you want to actually make a difference. Don't just punish someone for having, you know, a mansion. Like, there's lots of those people, and that's not going to do anything for your cause. If your cause is like, fuck them, they're rich, it's like, you can find a better way to make a difference.
Agreed.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for this week. If you require just a little bit more murder, you can get your fill on the OG MurderMurder.news with the latest breaking true crime news all week long.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurder.news, on Twitter at MurderNews, on TikTok at MurderMurder.news, and on Facebook by searching for MurderMurder.news.
And while you're on Facebook searching for Murder Murder News, you will also see our group pop up. And that group is where you can join our virtual book club. We're just starting The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and we'll meet on Zoom to discuss it on Sunday, October 30th.
Ooh, I'm excited for that book. I loved her last book we read for book club, Mexican Gothic. I thought was so lovely.
So good.
Yeah. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Reviews help new fans find the show and let us know what you're enjoying most about Murder Murder News. You should also subscribe on your preferred podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode.
Thanks for listening.
Bye, spooky friends.
See you next week.